Bien, buenos días. Continuamos con lo que es ya la última sesión del Congreso, que va a tener dos partes. En primer lugar, vamos a tener la conferencia de clausura a cargo de Hara, de la Dublin City University. Y acto seguido haremos un cierre muy breve del Congreso. Entonces, let me introduce you to Hara from Dublin City University. He is our keynote speaker, our last keynote speaker. It's a great honor to take the possibility to invite him to give the conference entitled Navigating the New Normal, Exploring the Role of the Educational Research and the Educational Research Association in Transforming and Transforming Times. Thank you so much, Joe, for accepting our invitation to be here. We like that you stay here, but you will participate in online. Talking about the curriculum video of Joe is amazing. I only select a couple of things. He holds the chair of education in his university, in Dublin City University. He's director of the Center for Evaluation, Quality and Inspection, was president of the Educational Studies Association of Ireland, is the current director and founding member of the Irish Evaluation Network, is member of the board of the Center for Talent Youth in Ireland, is the current president of the European Educational Research Association, and is a very good friend, a very good person. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and many thanks for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a great honor to be with you. Of course, I wish I was with you in Salamanca, a city I've been lucky enough to visit a number of times as part of different projects, but hopefully we will be there in the future. So I will now try the technical thing of sharing my screen, and hopefully this works. Can everybody see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so today what I'd hoped to do was chat a little bit about the idea of educational research and educational research associations in these extraordinarily unusual times. I'll speak primarily from my role within IRA, the European Education Research Association, and try and bring in some of the challenges and ideas that we're being asked to focus at a European level, and then perhaps in conversation later we might see how they translate into national and regional levels, both within Spain and maybe within the broader European idea. Just briefly, for those of you who don't know about IRA, IRA is an association of associations. We've 42 member associations from 37 countries and regions. We have 34 as of last week. We've 34 academic networks addressing issues relating to educational research across the whole gamut of research and across the continuum of research contexts. And approximately, we think that our members represent about 20,000 educational researchers within Europe. So it's a substantial community of researchers, and it's a substantial community of researchers focused on the idea of doing high quality educational research. We've had a very positive and strong relationship with colleagues in Spain. Our most recent conference in Spain was in Cadiz in 2012. So we're well due to return, just putting it out there for anybody who wants to invite us. We also have had some excellent inputs from the Spanish research community at our keynote levels, at many different levels, and the most recent one being last year in our what was our online conference in the Reconnecting Era conference last year, where Ramon Flecha from Barcelona gave one of our keynote addresses. So we have a long-standing engagement with Spanish research and Spanish research associations. And on our executive council, we're represented by 2 Spanish associations. AIDIPE and SEP. So and Gonzalo and Eduardo are the two representatives on that, and I know they're involved in this as well. So we've a very long-standing engagement and commitment, and we've benefited enormously from the input from colleagues within Spain. So in many ways, I think this conference is as interesting for us to see how it works and to see how the ideas that emerge from a Spanish context can feed into Europe. So what do we do, and what do I want to talk about? Well, IRA has a very simple motto. We talk about doing high quality research for the benefit, excuse me, of education and society. That's what we set ourselves as our key criterion. Our key aim is to do this. And you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of my slides, if you can see it, this is our summary of what we do: research for the benefit of education and society. But over the last couple of years, I mean, the challenge has been, how do we do this in a time of COVID? How do we do this in a transformational time, socially, economically, and educationally? And I mean, that's something that's been challenging us, and I think it's been challenging all researchers throughout Europe. And hopefully we can talk about this a little bit. Sorry. So to begin with, it's almost a requirement to start with Gramsci somewhere in one of these things. But going back to his prison notebooks from the 1930s, in another time of crisis, I think Gramsci raises a very interesting point, which is that the thing about the crisis that maybe we're going through now, and this is maybe hyperbolic to an extent, that the old is dying and the new can't be born. We're in this strange period between what came before and what's going to come afterwards. And it's a time of great dynamism, and it's a time of great opportunity. Gramsci talks about morbid symptoms being a period, but maybe slightly more positively, Viv Ellis, who's Dean of Education in Monash University in Australia, talks about this period as being a two-staged process that we're going through. The first stage, in terms of the pandemic impact on research and educational research, was the stabilization of the situation. That much of our early focus, perhaps we're still in this phase now, I mean, these are debatable points, but much of our early focus in the context of what we're doing as educational researchers is stabilization, trying to ensure that systems that we had in place can continue to serve those who need to be served by educational systems. And perhaps we're also rethinking practices. That might be happening simultaneously, and it may be the basis for a new way forward in terms of what we do as educational researchers. So another way of looking at the same idea. And then, of course, though, and these are my colleagues Paolo Landry and Sotiria Grech, who edit the European Educational Research Journal. They're bringing up one of the issues that I think all of us probably sense as being important in terms of the research we're doing at the moment, which is the risks of doing educational research in what they call a time of acceleration. Everything is happening with enormous rapidity these days. The demands being placed on us are very large, but the time frame that we're being asked to deliver in has really been accelerated. And there's a challenge to us to think about how we as researchers respond to that need for stability and respond to that need for rethinking, but don't get completely dominated by the accelerated time frame that we're working in. And thinking about that, I think, is a challenge to all of us. And to give you an example of this, our journal, the European Educational Research Journal, as with many journals, and I know many of the journals that colleagues here will be involved in, they put out a call for research that was happening during a special issue, trying to find out what was happening in terms of educational research. And they received 180 submissions last summer. So this is 6 months into the pandemic. 180 submissions around the research that was happening within education, influenced by the pandemic, was submitted. So there's been a massive reorientation of educational research over the last year to 18 months into pandemic issues and into COVID-19 issues. And that's completely understandable. All of our lives have been reorientated. And there's an enormous quantity of short-term sort of firefighting immediate research and maybe medium-term research, trying to track things. The beginning of longitudinal studies you're beginning to see emerge. But one of the interesting challenges, when we come out of this period and when we hopefully move to whatever we move to next, what's going to happen to this research? Is this research very context specific in that it's only research that's relevant to the work that, or the experience we're going through at the moment? Or how do we bring this into rethinking our practices, and how do we do this? And I think, to me, that is one of the enormous challenges of this period for us as researchers and for us as research associations. How do we curate what we're doing now, and then how do we bring it to whatever we go to or wherever we're going to? And I think that's a big challenge to us. And perhaps it's a creative tension, and perhaps it's a necessary creative tension. It's incumbent on anybody from Ireland to quote an Irish poet in one of our speeches. So this is W.B. Yeats, who 100 years ago spoke about all being changed and changed utterly. So perhaps that's one side of our understanding of where we are in terms of research. And then the massive social, political, personal desire to get back to normal. And whatever normal is, but I think it's become a common theme and a common cry in most places. So this creative tension, I think, is not only at a social level, it's also within our research commitments and our research engagements. And how do we manage this, and how do we engage with that as research associations? Well, one way, and just to go back to EERJ for a minute, and this isn't the only way, but one way that they tried to do was they tried to frame this using Popkowitz and Braidotti's idea of histories of the present, trying to bring theoretical and empirical exercises normally applied in a historical context to the present situation, to see if we can see the full complexities and the full gamut. Rather than focusing on an accelerated single issue, we try and look at it in a broader sense and thinking about maybe imagined scenarios. And I think that's a useful way for us maybe to project ourselves forward. What are the areas in the future? What are the areas that our imagination, what areas will become important as we move into the next short while? And some areas that have emerged, say, in our most recent European Conference for Education and Research, themes that are quite significant in terms of the materials that are being submitted to education research. So you see them here. I'm sure they're ones that you will have come across as well. The issue of digitization, technology-supported learning, the roles of assessment, areas of diversity and identity, areas around datification of society, well-being, the transformation of teacher education. I'm sure each of you and each of your associations could add quite a number of additional topics there. But they're just some of the ideas that maybe are emerging as being important. Some were there before. I think all have been transformed by our COVID experience, and we need to think about them in the context of the future. And in terms of which ones we decide to focus on, well, we go back to the classic who, why, what, when, where, and how questions that we all ask all the time. And I suppose we bring to the answer to the question of what do we focus on or what will be important, our own particular contextual knowledge and our own understanding of the multi-levels that we do educational research at, whether it's our context, our national context that maybe your research associations represent, or our regional context, or whether it's a transnational context that somewhere like IRA represents, and to see what are the themes. So some of the themes that have emerged from an IRA perspective, some of the issues that we think are important at a European level, which is of course informed by our national associations, are around maybe three ideas, and I'll spend the rest of the time that I have maybe discussing these. The first one is, well, like, why are we doing educational research? We have a clear idea why, as I mentioned. We do education research for the benefit of education and society. But why do we do it? What is the function and purpose of educational research? Which leads us into thinking about, well, look, what is the nature of educational research? It's not homogeneous. The nature of educational research isn't the same everywhere, nor should it be. And yet, sometimes there's an interpretation of educational research that privileges one particular perspective or privileges one particular idea. And maybe the final one, and not in any way the least important, is that who does educational research? How does our community continue to enrich itself and develop itself and bring new people into the educational research field, and the challenges posed to that? So I'll try and deal with these in a slightly more in-depth way. The first one is, like, why do we do education research? And again, from an ERA perspective, we're very clear. We're doing it to benefit education and society. And one of the key issues there is trying to have an influence at a policy level. And yet this is a big challenge for us. And it's a big challenge, at a European level. And I know for many of our associations, it can be a challenge at a national level as well. That the enormous amount of educational research that we undertake and the enormous amount of work that we undertake as researchers, are we actually involved in the policy conversations? Are we there when decisions are made that influenced the educational provision that we spend our lives engaging with at a research level? And if so, how did we get there? And if not, why aren't we there? And I think that's a really interesting question for us. And we have different experiences across Europe, and different policy and different societal constructions see that happening in different ways, which is linked to the educational research, the nature of what we do, which we look at in a minute. But it's also in some ways and in some places linked to an ideological and a systemic discounting of educational research that doesn't fit in particular policy agendas and particular ideological agendas, whether they be regional, national, or transnational. So in other words, there's a type of educational research that's privileged, and then there's a type of educational research that isn't necessarily privileged at a positive policy level. And then there's a type of educational research we do and we think is important that may not have the capacity to speak to those who make policy decisions. And then we have to ask ourselves, given the enormous number of people who are doing educational research, if we have 20,000 members associated with IRA, if they're not being heard, or even if they're only being partially heard, is this an enormously wasted resource? And how do we harness that, the massive work that we as researchers do and you and your research associations do? How is that harnessed to positively influence educational provision across the continuum, to ensure that, to go back to our motto, that we benefit, the educational research we do benefits society? And is at the heart of this a failure of communication? Is at the heart of this a failure on our part to explain how we do and what we do to audiences who maybe don't use our language? And we'll talk about language in a few moments as well. So I think that's an important aspect. Of course, the point about this is it's not that easy to actually get involved in these conversations, as I think maybe all of you know, and we definitely know in IRA, it's difficult. So it's hard work. Mobilization is about interpersonal relationships. It's not just writing excellent papers or excellent reports. And goodwill needs fostering. We need to be able to create these relationships. And that can be a challenge. It's definitely a challenge during COVID, because of the different way we're being forced to generate relationships and the different way we're being forced to engage with each other. And perhaps arguably, and some would argue that the prioritization of research metrics and output metrics mean that we become more and more focused on producing rather than engaging. And maybe that's a critique for us as well. And we've known this for a long time. I don't want to read all of this, but this goes back to Pamela Munn, who was president of BIRA over 15 years ago, or nearly 15 years ago now. And they were very exercised in the British Education Research Association about this issue then. And the last one I think is particularly interesting, and one that's been a challenge to us. It challenges us to think about, how do we disseminate our findings? How do we communicate what we do? How do we find new ways? And even since 2018, 2008, we've had an explosion of methods for communication through social media and through different aspects. So how do we translate what we do in a way? And I think that's a substantial challenge to us. And within the IRA blog, which I'll talk about in a second, there's been a really interesting blog by our Network 23, which is policy studies and education, looking at specifically at this. How do we look at what we've done in the past in order to influence the future of policy research? And that brings me to a point that maybe that we're trying to do within IRA, we have established an IRA blog. This is a new initiative for us, but it's specifically targeted at finding a way to disseminate the research that's happening within the IRA community in a new and more accessible way. So in the first year, and these numbers have gone up since this, we've had about 27,000 engagements with our blog postings in the last year. We've had 46 blog posts from 9 associations and 20 networks, 13,000 visitors. And by whatever metric you use, the idea that over 20,000 people have engaged with educational research in a different and in a new way, I think is a very positive one. And I think it's one that shows the reason why and the benefits of doing something like this and thinking about new methods. And again, I think we're all increasingly active in social media and trying to find ways. Of course, there is the other critique of this, which says, as educational researchers, we're not there to write blog posts, we're not there to write tweets, we're there to do good quality research. And in some ways, that's a creative tension, again, we need to think about. But from an ERA perspective, this has been, excuse me, massively successful. And some of our member associations have moved further. They do podcasts, they do video blogs, vlogs, and all things like this. And suddenly there's the realization that there are multiple channels for us to communicate what we do. And ultimately, I suppose that's why we do research, which is to get an audience for what we do. We passionately believe as researchers in what we do, and we need to think about ways of translating and transmitting that. Some of our member associations, and I'm sure your colleagues in Spain will have exemplars of this as well, were very formally involved in policy inputs during the pandemic period. These are our colleagues in Italy, where educational research associations, not individuals, not institutions, but associations were part of the discussion in a formal way with the state, with the government, to try and have a formal input with policy. And I think that's very interesting, because I think we're used to individual engagements. We're also used to institutional engagements, but from an educational research organization or network perspective, I think that was quite important. And again, throughout Europe, we had many different experiences in relation to how this happened. And maybe this, now moving into a second thing, maybe part of what we need to think about is, as well as communicating what we do better, think about how we do things, and perhaps looking at interdisciplinarity and synthetic type of research, and maybe thinking about where have we made mistakes as educational researchers in the context of trying to transmit what we do. And one of the great themes of European research over the last decade has been this idea of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, bringing multiple disciplinary ideas together. And perhaps as educational researchers, we haven't done this. And this was a BIRA event, which subsequently became a blog around this again. How do we avoid them in the future? And the thing is maybe thinking about a synthetic interdisciplinarity, which leads me to the second point then. Do we need to rethink how we do educational research? Do we need to rethink what educational research is? Now, this is a much bigger topic than we can address here, but I think part of what we need to think about is exactly who we are. And maybe not surprisingly, maybe surprisingly, depending on where we come from, by far the most widely read blog posting we've had on the ERA blog has been this one by Dominic Wise, the then president of the British Education Research Association, which asked the fundamental question of what are we? Are we a discipline or are we a field of study? What is educational research? Now, however we fall down on this, and I know many of our perspectives on this will come from our own disciplinary context. But the idea that this is something that engages us hugely as a community within ERA, I think is really interesting. And perhaps one of the challenges we have comes from the sheer diversity and complexity of what we do. Our colleagues in the European Alliance of Social Science and Humanities, an umbrella group that ERA was a founding member of, it now consists of 67 social science and humanities groups who come together to lobby at a European level. They did a mapping exercise of Scopus journals to look at the thematic areas that emerged in educational research. And there's the visual in front of you. Very complex. I think we can probably see our own areas within that. That in itself was interesting. But what was even more fascinating was when they did a similar thing to law. And in some ways, this is not anyway denigrating law, which is a very important subject. But I think what it does show is the sheer complexity of the areas that we look at as educational researchers. And there's an over diffusion, maybe an over specialization, or maybe that's absolutely necessary. But it is an interesting challenge when you look at the sheer amount of areas of specialism and the sheer amount of areas of engagement as researchers that we look at and that we engage in and that we produce high quality research in comparison to law. From our perspective, one of the big issues that we have in ERA is trying to recapture and define and develop a European dimension in educational research. In ERA, although we had support from the European Union being established in the 1990s, we are not a European Union organization, and we don't define our conception of European, and we don't limit it to the EU. We see it's a Council of Europe definition, which effectively means we go from Greenland to Vladivostok, if we want to look at it in that way. But it's quite an extensive understanding and a broadening understanding and a broadening conceptualization of what it means to be European. And this is an important question for us, because the concept of Europeanism and how it impacts the way we do research as educators is becoming more and more current. And if we don't define this ourselves, others are doing it. So at the moment, one of the big initiatives, as we know, within the EU is the European Research Area. And it's an emerging research area, and there's a lot of work being done on it, and it's a very important area. And we could discuss this at length, but the point I'd like to take at the bottom one is the final objective at the bottom, which is making progress and free circulation of knowledge, researchers and technology through stronger cooperation with EU countries. And that's an interesting challenge for an organization like IRA, because, of course, we're bigger than EU countries, and we need to think about how do we define Europeanism in a greater and in a broader sense. And on another side of that, I'm sure those conversations happen throughout, and I know those conversations happen throughout of identity happen at a local and a regional level as well. There's different research traditions, again, without either agreeing or disagreeing with this. I think the point that this research tries to, or that ZAP's research of a couple of years ago talks about, is that the way we think about research in Europe is not homogenous. So there's the multidisciplinary endeavor idea that perhaps I come from in the Anglo-American tradition. There's the education and research as a discipline, or educational research embedded in educational sciences. Now, where Spain fits into that, perhaps that's an argument that you know yourselves. ZAP suggested you're part of the second category there. But without agreeing with it or not, I think the idea is that at a European level, there's a recognition that we do things differently. And at a European level, there's an understanding that we bring to the idea and the concept of educational research something unique and something different. And I think that's important. And how do we feed this in to policy decisions? And again, going back to the Euro blog, one of the things that we've successfully done is to try and bring the knowledge and the experiences and the history and the understanding of educational research to a wider audience. And one of the more successful ones here was Gonzalo Cover's History of the Spanish Pedagogical Society. Again, the idea is saying, this is who we are, this is where we come from, and this is what we prioritize as a research association in our particular context, and this is what you can learn from us. And I think that's particularly important. And it's not without its challenges. Our colleagues here from Ukraine spoke about their desire and their interest in becoming embedded in a European research quality indicator system and teaching and researching on European subjects. So there's a real sense that the European way of doing research is something to aspire to. Now, that's mixed up in history and politics and sociology and all of these sort of things. But it also, from an ERA perspective, it comes from a specific targeted initiative we made over the last number of years to expand to what maybe were post-Soviet countries and Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And this has been a really interesting learning experience for all of us, because they bring an enormous richness and different traditions to us. And this dynamic realignment within ERA, and I would argue within European research, is leading us to go to Yerevan in Armenia for our conference next year. And the big thing about a European Conference in Educational Research, which is our flagship event, is it is in a university community hosted by a local research community and embedded in that context. And the idea is that we bring the contextual and historic and research traditions of that community to the wider ERA organization, and vice versa. We bring ERA to that as well. So this is a really important step for us. This is the furthest east we've gone, and and we're literally at a country that's at the crossroads of Europe in many ways. So I think that's very interesting and a challenge to us, of course. And this is maybe something that we might need to think about again, and our experiences here are interesting. Are we going to, as research associations, continue to do these type of big conferences? There's a lot of stuff out there at the moment talking about hybridity as being the future of conferences. And what does that mean to us as researchers and research associations and research communities? Is this way of me talking to you from Dublin to you in Spain going to be the way that we do things in future? I think there's strengths and weaknesses in that, but we need to rethink this. This is going to be a huge challenge to us. A second thing in this is the language of educational research. Edward Kiner, one of my colleagues, from previous colleagues on the IRA Council, speaks about the necessity to relativize the monoculturality of the English language, or in other words, to stop the dominance of the Anglo way of doing research, thinking about research, and speaking about research. And that's a huge challenge. And in IRA, for example, our language of operation is English. And that's just a necessity. But is there a sufficient justification that we produce educational research only in English? And increasingly, you're seeing this tension between the capacity to produce high quality and impactful international research in the indigenous language of our research associations, as opposed to the requirement then to translate that into English. And what do you lose? And one of my favorite comments was from an early career researcher who, when I complimented them on the quality of their paper, they said, if you think that was good, you should hear me in my own language. So there's this real sense that we lose something in the translation, if I can put it that way. And we need to think about that. And language is really important then. I mean, just Adviv's study of the last couple of months talks about the importance of linguistic proximateness as opposed to geographic proximity when we're doing research, which I think is really very interesting, that we tend to do research with people whose language that we speak or we're connected to. Now, the European Union has tried to change that in a way through its Erasmus and its multilateral projects, but I think that's interesting in itself. And funnily enough, it struck me that over the summer, one of the more fascinating things at the WIRA conference was to see the Ibero-American and the Spanish Research Associations conference coming together. And clearly in Spain, you have an enormous hinterland, linguistic hinterland and research hinterland that you draw from and you bring together. And I think that's a fascinating sort of set of experiences and knowledge that you can bring to the wider research community. How do we support this in IRA then? Well, I mean, it's funny, we recognize the challenges of having maybe an English dominance, but we also try and support people. So one of the things we do are educational research workshops, how to write education research in English, which is very popular, and we connect those to national research associations, and we do a lot of work on that. And just to finish on that, we also connect it to particularly our early career researchers, which then brings me maybe to the third point. Fran, can you just tell me how long I have left? Just I'm unsure as to.
You can take another 10, 15 minutes.
Great. Okay, thanks. That's super. Okay, so then we have the third major challenge, I think, and it's one of the major challenges that we see at an IRA level, which is who's going to do the research in the future, and the challenge of precarity, the challenge of precarious work conditions for our younger and our emerging researchers. Another association or another organization we're involved in is the ISE, the Initiative for Science in Europe, and they produced a paper on the academic precarity in Europe. And also the OECD has been doing this, and a lot of organizations have been doing this. And one of the things that we're thinking about is the transforming educational research ecosystem, if we can put it in rather grand terms, but how things are changing for our younger researchers. And one of the things that was drawn out of the OECD report is that in many countries, the working conditions of early career researchers are insufficiently attractive to retain the best national and international talent. And that's a really challenging issue for us as senior researchers and as people who run and organize and are interested in research associations. What the experience is internationally is that we're losing high quality researchers out of the system because of the manner in which their terms and conditions of employment. Now, it's not everywhere, and we're privileged at the moment in my institution, DCU, to have 3 Spanish PhD students with us. And clearly they receive an enormous amount of support, both financially and in terms of their integration into the Spanish Research Association and the Spanish research way of doing things, but that's not a universal experience. In fact, in some ways, it may be on the outskirts because other people don't have that experience. So early career researcher precarity is a big thing. Issues around the monoculturality in research and lack of concern for well-being of early career researchers, both in terms of their research profile and their employment profile. Increasingly within the academic world in different parts of Europe. I'm not sure if it's universal. And again, your experience in Spain may be different. But in many of our member associations in ERA, early career researchers have very limited and very difficult employment constructs to work within. No permanent positions, no tenured positions, short-term focus contracts, which end and leave them without any future career path. And that's an enormous issue as well. There's also one of the challenges around SSH funding, which is as big. Social science and humanities don't get as much funding as other areas, and education as a social science suffers from that. Although one of the interesting things that you might have seen, and one of the areas where the ability for social science and humanities to come together to influence positively research contexts can be seen in the Horizon Europe increase in the budget for SSH from 1 billion euros to 1.9 billion euros. And that was led, or at least it was heavily influenced by the lobbying done by EASH, the European Alliance of Social Science and Humanities, and by organizations like ERA and feeding on our national associations as well. So it is possible to change this, but it is a challenge. And of course, for many of our member associations and many of our countries, the funding model of higher education pre-COVID relied on large quantities of international students coming in, paying large fees to keep programs running, and that broke for a while, and maybe it's been replaced now by online, we don't know, but it's been a very difficult and a very different period in that. So again, the next generation of this, 70% are on short-term contracts. Now, this is not in education, this is in general. 60% that felt that COVID had a significant impact on their funding continuity, increased demands, well-being, fraying of it. The gendered impact of COVID, I don't think we can underestimate this at all. COVID has had a significant differential impact depending on gender, and the research experience of researchers from the most senior to the most junior have been very gendered, with a significantly additional negative impact on female researchers. And then there's an interesting specific challenge in educational research. And again, this may be nationally and regionally contextual, but in many of our countries and many of our member associations, educational researchers tend to be later vocationally focused and experienced professionals who come into educational and academic research positions later in life. They don't necessarily come in the pathway that sees them finishing undergraduate education and moving straight into postgraduate education. Again, my experience of the Spanish colleagues who are working with us is that that's clearly different in some aspects of Spain, but not always. But it is a really interesting point about who funds educational research. In many countries, educational research is self-funded. It's funded by professionals who are interested in developing their own career pathways. And that's a challenge for us as well. But it's also a huge benefit to us as well, because much of the research we have has a very strong practitioner focus and a very strong lens of experience and experienced researchers coming in to do it. So I think we can grow on that as well. In ERA, we have the Emerging Researchers Group, which is a hugely important element of it. We have the ECR, the European Conference for Emerging Researchers, always happens before it. And this is a really important strategic focus for us within ERA. And it's one of the strategic foci that we request any new member of ERA to have, which is to have a focused and detailed commitment to developing and providing opportunities for emerging researchers, for younger researchers, because we really see this as being critical and we really seeing this as being important. So we do things in terms of capacity building, in terms of trying to find funding, and also in trying to find an ecosystem. And Sania Qureshi, just quoting here, tries to write about what she's our Emerging Researchers Group coordinator, and she was trying to write to say, well, what exactly is this ecosystem? And she comes up with a few ideas of what younger researchers might need. It's giving them the skills to assess what they need. It's giving them the connection to mentors or coaches. It's creating opportunities for them to move forward in a partnership way with more senior researchers. And it's also the creation of communities of practice, to try and give younger researchers and emerging researchers the type of supported ecosystem that we all have as more senior researchers. We have a cohort, a group of people around us, our colleagues and our friends, who we've developed over many years. And it's how we replicate that for younger researchers who are perhaps in a more challenging situation than we are. And then, without going into these in any great detail, arguably this transition to a different educational research ecosystem is common throughout all aspects of what we're doing. And as we begin to see, if you look back at the Easter conference that we had online in Geneva, if we begin to think about where we're looking at next year in Yerevan, what you're beginning to see is a whole different set of ideas emerging. So we've got the permeability of educational spaces that happened during COVID. The idea that walls were broken down and parents, students, and different stakeholders suddenly had a direct insight into what we did as educators, and maybe had then more of a voice and wanted more of a voice. And that was maybe the first stage of COVID. There was an awful lot of this happened throughout Europe. So many of the key flashpoints were around issues of digitization and the capacity to access higher education and access issues in higher education, or just being able to take part in the online learning mode that seemed to be the standard mode. Around assessment. Throughout Europe, there were huge challenges in terms of what happened with terminal assessment or even interim assessment systems within schools, where we were used to doing things in a certain way in person. How did you translate that into a virtual setting? And many European countries and many education researchers struggled with this. And in fact, that's where a lot of the education research community had a direct influence and impact on emergency provisions that emerged around assessment systems. And of course, that translated as well into teacher education, which is another significant element of what we do as researchers. How can you train teachers in a virtual way? A lot of programs around Europe still have placement and professional placement as a key aspect. When that disappears, how can you certify teacher education students in that type of thing? So there was a lot of conversation around that, and a longer conversation about who has the right to speak, where does the voice come from? And maybe there was a wider and a broader set of conversations around where do we want to go and where do we need to go in terms of the purpose of education. So then just to bring this to a close, perhaps. So where are we going to go in the future? If we're exercising our imagination, if we've thought about who we are, what we do, and why we do it, well, where are we going to go in the future? I think increasingly there's going to be the challenge to us to get back to normal. And I would term that a seductive challenge, because if we don't take account of what we've learned over the last 18 months to 2 years, I think we've lost an enormous richness. But we do need to find that balance of what do we bring with us and what don't we bring with us, and how do we do that? I think that to us is a huge challenge as researchers and education researchers. What sort of research are we going to do? When do we move from the rapid crisis-focused research we may be initiated to more longitudinal embedded research? Or do we keep them both going in parallel? And how do we do that? How do we record what we did? One of the worries I personally would have is that a lot of what was done over the last year to 18 months, hugely innovative, massively energy sapping research, will be lost, because either it wasn't recorded in a way that was done that we consider to be appropriate in terms of academic publication, or it was just done for an emergency setting. It worked brilliantly in that setting, but it's now disappeared. Now, there are attempts to try and find ways of doing this. The World Pandemic Research Network was one such area, to try and say, anybody who's done anything, please just upload it here. And maybe that will happen, and maybe we'll rediscover that. But really, as research associations, I think we need to think about, how do we archive this? How do we find a way of recognizing and valuing the enormously important research leading to practice, and practice drawing from research that was done over the last 18 months to 2 years? Then we need to think about, increasingly, how do we look at other voices? How do we broaden the conversation around educational research to include different voices, whether they be voices from the South. And again, here the Spanish relationship with Ibero-America, I think, is hugely important. But how do we bring different voices into this? And how do we expand our understanding of what is a legitimate set of voices in research and voices from the non-Anglophone world? How do we stop people like me who speak English as a primary language dominating conversations and discourse? And then ultimately, how do we create research community and how do we maintain research community? And I think, again, these are hugely important. I won't read this as well, but basically, this is an argument to slow down. Don't go too quickly, slow down. Don't be driven by acceleration. Try and think about what we do. And that's Landry and Greg. So I finish with an invitation to all of you to join us in Yerevan next year if you can. There will be an online element of the conference as well as a face-to-face element of the conference, and this is something we're working through at the moment, and it's a very interesting challenge for us. And I would also encourage any of you who wish to write for our blog to bring your knowledge and your experience of education research to the blog, to join us, to follow us on Easter, on Facebook and on Twitter. And I hope to see you soon. And thank you once again for the opportunity to engage with this. And thank you for listening. And please, any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Joy, for this inspiring and to all the questions you have raised with your speech and with your keynote. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Is there any questions in the chat, or is there any question in the room? There are too many greetings for your keynote in the online chat. And Maria Jose now is going to make him a question in perfect English, please. Yeah, are you listening, Maria Jose?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Are you listening, Maria Jose?
I can hear her, yeah, not very well though.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to translate her.
Okay, yes, perfect.
Thank you, Jeff, for your keynote. We are waiting for submitting interesting research paper to the conference from our. She's giving you your thanks again about your support the internationalization of our institute, receiving our students in your group, collaborating in European projects and so on. Thank you so much for your support. And you are invited to stay with us here in Salamanca, because the hybrid mode is more interesting when you are face to face with us and not in the other side of the screen.
Yes. Thank you.
This is a free translation of. Yes.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. I was thinking that you mentioned that one of the challenges how to move from our papers to the impact on society. I was thinking that it's one of the most difficult challenges for us as every career researcher, because all the time we devote to other things like publishing newspaper or doing conferences or even giving classes to public administration, so stakeholders and so on. Is something that is not, so it's not in our curriculum. So it's not, we cannot use it in our career. So I was thinking, if you have already thought of ways to encouraging us to devote more time to transferring our knowledge to society instead of just publishing on papers that we read just because we need to publish more. And it's a kind of
publish or perish.
Yeah, like I in some ways, I'm very glad that I'm not an early career researcher anymore, that I'm gray-haired and moving towards the end, because it is an enormously complex challenge to you. Because there are very defined career pathways that you have to follow, and that's fine because they're built over a long period of time, and they emerge from an understanding of the skills and competences that you need to demonstrate that you're a high quality researcher. And I think that's, we cannot forget that. That's really important to do. But at the same time, we need to find some way of acknowledging when you translate research into a wider setting and a wider organization. Many different associations and many different institutions now have a translation element, and translation by which I mean taking research from academia and moving it into wider society as being part of an employment set of criteria. How successful have you been in translating it? And things like altmetrics and other measurement instruments that are emerging from publishers try in some way to capture that. And then I think it's incumbent on those of us who are more senior in institutions to help you prioritize that. I know in many different institutions there are service and engagement criteria when it comes around to employment and promotion and things like that. And I think we need to find a way of seeing how can we move them back into the early career researchers' experience. But then at another level, and I don't want in any way downplay the challenges of being an early career researcher, because I think there is a uniquely challenging set of circumstances at the moment about making that transition from a researcher on the cusp of an academic career, if that's what you want to do, into an academic career. And it may be policies, it may be political ideologies around employment and the way we do this, but in many of our associations and many of our member countries, the manner in which we may have moved into professional academic lives, it's much more complex now. And I think there's a big challenge there in relation to how we fund higher education, how we value those who do higher education, and how we make sure that we continue to have the best people coming into educational research. Because if we don't, we all suffer, and if we don't, we lose the best people. So it's a long answer. I hope it makes some sense.
Another question? Yes.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. What would be an important point to consider when initiating a transition to this new research ecosystem?
Do you have?
What would be an important point? Well, an important point, I think, is who is going to do it. I think that's important. How is it going to be funded? I think that's going to be very important as well. What are we going to focus on? I think we need to have some sort of, I think if we don't ourselves as educational researchers define what we think are key points, other people will do it for us. So I think we need to have some sort of sense of what are the areas that we consider to be important. And that's where the idea of interdisciplinarity, even within education, is important. How can we set the agenda? What do we think are important elements to it? So I think that's another issue. I think another issue as well is, and from a European perspective, is how do we bring a European sensibility to conversations around education? How do we bring what we understand as a European idea, if we have one, into education? IRA has a very simple way of doing this at one level, which is that we try and encourage different colleagues from different European settings to work together. So it's that internal dialogue and research to try and develop something. But what is this going to be when the European research area is defining itself as research and sharing knowledge and information within the EU? Is this a legitimate identification of Europe with the EU in terms of research and what we do as research? So there's a lot of ways of doing this, but I do think I go back to my three themes. Why are we doing it? How do we do it? And who does it? I think there are three key things we need to think about.
Any questions? No more questions. And thank you, Joe, for your conference. I agree with perhaps the most interesting underlined idea of your conference, that after we did a lot of emerging actions to survive in the pandemic time. We are now in a very important moment just in order to decide, because we are in a dilemma. Or you say a seductive getting back to the past, or perhaps reflecting for changing, or trying to learn something from our experience. Then I hope we can reflect and not go to the back. Thank you so much for being with us in this conference.
Thank you. And thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. See you soon.
See you soon. Bien, pues continuamos ya en la última parte del Congreso para clausurarlo, para hacer una breve clausura. Y para ello, bueno, pues contamos con una de las personas que más ha promovido este Congreso, y de alguna manera también la red que ha dado lugar, no sé si al Congreso o el Congreso a la red, no sé, que ha sido antes el huevo o la gallina, que es Antonio Bartolomé Pina, catedrático de la Universidad de Barcelona y director del Instituto de Investigación Educativa de la Universidad de Barcelona, el IRED. Antonio, ¿estás ya conectado?
Sí.
Pues si pones el vídeo, te vemos. Bienvenido a Salamanca, te echamos mucho de menos. Aquí lo hemos pasado muy mal.
No me lo creo. Yo os echo de menos y con mucha envidia de no haber podido estar ahí. Bueno, lo primero que tengo que decir es que con esto ya estoy cerrando mi etapa de dirección en el instituto. Me sucederá Maripau Sandín, que seguramente lo va a hacer mucho mejor que yo, porque se encontrará con los problemas administrativos resueltos, que son los únicos que nos molestan en el instituto. Bueno, yo quiero agradecer a los otros institutos y al propio también de Barcelona, a todos los que se han animado a participar y a montar. En Salamanca habéis trabajado muy duro para poder sacar en medio de las dificultades esta conferencia. Estoy convencido de que si los institutos van a aportar algo a la educación y a la investigación educativa, va a ser porque trabajemos en red, trabajemos juntos y de esa manera lleguemos a crear un ecosistema investigador en educación que pueda competir con otros sistemas ya consolidados en otros países que llevan muchos años trabajando en el tema. Y la importancia de la investigación educativa, pues no hace falta reseñarla, ¿no? Necesitamos investigar para trabajar sobre evidencias y no sobre intuiciones, ¿no? También para evitar repetir e inventar la rueda cada pocos años, volviendo a repetir las mismas investigaciones o los mismos presupuestos que ya han sido superados anteriormente. También hay que pensar que estos institutos son institutos abiertos que nos permiten integrar a investigadores de otras áreas, desde psicología, sociología, que están aportando, o informática, ¿no? Que han hecho grandes aportaciones a la investigación educativa, pero que hasta ahora parecía como que estaban un poco fuera del área, ¿no? Como que eran extraños. Bueno, en los institutos son por carta de naturaleza miembros activos de los institutos y nada, es genial, yo creo, esta oportunidad que tenemos de por fin trabajar en red. Aparte de este pequeño comentario, mi función aquí es para comunicar los resultados del primer premio de la red de institutos de investigación en educación. Este premio salió en una de las reuniones porque pretendíamos estimular el diseño y desarrollo de proyectos de investigación educativas en el contexto de España, Portugal y Latinoamérica. La investigación educativa no necesita fomentarse, tenemos nuestros propios retornos, nuestra propia satisfacción en encontrar, en avanzar, ¿no? Pero pensamos de que hacía falta darle un reconocimiento y que la red de institutos podía ser el organismo adecuado para dar un reconocimiento independiente de las instituciones, independiente de las personas, ¿no? Bueno, la convocatoria está ahí, plantea los 4 objetivos. El primero es el que he dicho, estimular el diseño y desarrollo, y los otros 3, que básicamente es fomentar la calidad y los proyectos de investigación y divulgar buenas prácticas de investigación educativa. Así que, ¿qué es lo que ha pasado en este primer año? Que nos ha pillado muy a contrapelo, hemos tenido muy pocos meses para darlo a conocer. Yo la impresión que he sacado es que podemos estar contentos. Hemos recibido 13 candidaturas de 5 países. Pensad que el premio era complicado en el sentido de que hemos querido mantener un equilibrio entre no pedir más documentación, formularios, etcétera, a unos investigadores que, aunque nos hemos convertido en expertos en rellenar formularios para presentarnos a cualquier tipo de convocatoria, estamos ya también un poco hartos de eso, ¿no? Por otro lado, también queríamos que el premio funcionara con criterios lo más objetivables posible y que además marcaran la línea del premio. Bueno, pues agradecemos a los 13 candidatos que han presentado, a las 13 personas instituciones que han presentado candidaturas, y os voy a comentar los resultados del premio, que seguro que algunos al menos estarán emocionados esperando conocer el resultado. El premio se componía de 2 opciones, ¿no? Yo soy novato en esto, por lo tanto no lo voy a hacer bien. Jesús Salinas era el que tenía que hacerlo, que es ya especialista por los premios EduTech. Tenía 2 opciones. La de jóvenes investigadores. Era un premio dirigido a investigadores jóvenes. Realmente hace menos de 5 años que tenían que haber leído la tesis y bueno, nos hemos encontrado con 7 buenas contribuciones que han venido de Argentina, de Costa Rica y de España. Básicamente han sido tesis doctorales, muchas de ellas premios extraordinarios y con un nivel de publicaciones, pensando en que habían terminado hace 1 año o 2 años, muchas de ellas, un nivel de publicaciones envidiable que ya habría querido yo poder presentar en mi tesis doctoral, ¿no? Ha sido complicado. Este premio ha sido complicado y finalmente se ha resuelto a los puntos, pero bueno, se ha resuelto. Así que voy a leeros ahora el resultado del premio Jóvenes Investigadores. Este premio ha sido concedido a Carmen Trullo Oliva, del Departamento de Pedagogía de la Universidad de Girona, que ha presentado la investigación titulada El empoderamiento de las personas jóvenes con medida de convivencia en grupo educativo de medio abierto. Análisis de la tarea socioeducativa y diseño de estrategias para la intervención en el sistema de justicia juvenil. El jurado ha emitido los siguientes comentarios. Destaca este proyecto por su proyección social, la valoración del impacto de la intervención socioeducativa en jóvenes que han cumplido la medida judicial de convivencia en grupo educativo de medio abierto en Cataluña por delitos de violencia filioparental. Hay que pensar que este es un tema hoy importante para la sociedad y la violencia de género, pero la violencia filioparental es a la que se refiere en concreto este proyecto. El análisis de los resultados muestra que esa intervención, que ha sido estudiada a partir de una muestra reducida, pero con un seguimiento muy cercano, esta intervención favorece la autoestima y la eficacia, porque, bueno, el proyecto quiere trabajar el empoderamiento. Sin embargo, también ha encontrado que esta intervención presenta déficits en relación con la actividad social y colectiva. La investigación ha encontrado un camino de diseminación equilibrado entre las revistas científicas de calidad, en el nivel Q1 de los indicadores más importantes, JCR, SJR, y las revistas más próximas a los profesionales a nivel nacional y local. Y finalmente, esta es una tesis que se encuentra enmarcada en un proyecto financiado por el programa I+D, de Retos de la Sociedad, que es también un aspecto que nos parece interesante. La tesis, el proyecto que ha presentado este joven investigador ha sido valorado con los criterios que se han indicado y ha obtenido la máxima puntuación. El proceso de evaluación ha consistido en que cada proyecto había un jurado formado por representantes de 6 institutos. Cada proyecto ha sido evaluado por 3 institutos que han puntuado cada uno de los 11 criterios que se habían seleccionado, que se habían indicado en la convocatoria. Y bien, felicidades a Carmen Trullo Oliva, que recibirá un certificado de este premio. Y el segundo premio es el premio más fuerte, más importante, el de grupos consolidados. Existen muchos grupos consolidados, grupos importantes. Al premio se han presentado solo 6 grupos, de México, El Salvador y España, todos con un excelente currículum investigador. Y el resultado del premio, el premio ha sido concedido al Grupo de Estudios e Investigación Educativa en Tecnologías de la Comunicación, Orientación e Intervención Sociocultural, que dirige el doctor Ignacio Aguaded, catedrático en la Facultad de Educación, Psicología y Ciencias del Deporte de la Universidad de Huelva. Los 3 proyectos que presentó este grupo eran YouTubers e Instagramers, la competencia mediática en los prosumidores emergentes. Es un proyecto financiado por la Agencia Estatal de Investigación del Ministerio de Ciencia, Innovación y Universidades, y en este proyecto habían participado 12 universidades. El segundo proyecto, en el que codirige un miembro del grupo, competencias mediáticas de la ciudadanía en medios digitales emergentes, smartphone y tablets. Está financiado por el Programa Estatal de Investigación, Desarrollo e Innovación orientada a los retos de la sociedad 2015-2018 y cuenta con la participación de 13 universidades. El tercer proyecto era Media in Action, financiado por la Comisión Europea a través de la convocatoria Media Literacy for All, con la participación de 5 países europeos. Los comentarios que ha emitido el jurado, contribuyendo aparte a las valoraciones, el grupo destaca por su contribución teórica y metodológica al ámbito de la educomunicación, acreditada por proyectos nacionales y europeos, así como por un número muy elevado de publicaciones indexadas en revistas de impacto, así como por actuaciones de transferencia e impacto social vinculado a las relaciones entre educación, comunicación y cultura y prácticas digitales emergentes. Es un grupo consolidado y los 3 proyectos que presenta no solo se incluyen en una línea de investigación actual, relevante, novedosa y de interés, sino que en los 3 casos son proyectos competitivos, uno de ellos europeo y los otros 2 I+D. Y se ha valorado el elevado nivel de los proyectos presentados, así como por la estrategia de difusión de los resultados en el mundo académico. Igualmente se emitirá un certificado por este primer premio, y a todos los demás que han participado y no han obtenido el premio, decirles que el jurado lo ha valorado muy positivamente a todos los grupos. Y en el caso de jóvenes investigadores realmente ha sido complicado, así que hemos estado en un tris de no poder comunicarlo hoy, porque el jurado lo ha estado discutiendo activamente. Finalmente, por 4 votos a 2, ha salido este joven investigador. Y no sé, Fran, esto era todo lo que yo tenía que decir.
Bien, este aplauso para los 2 premios. Antes hubo un aplauso, pero estaba el micrófono apagado y no se escuchó. O sea que lo hacemos extensivo a los 2 premios. Muchísimas gracias a los jurados por haber hecho este trabajo, que es siempre complicado y por tanto siempre, y además poco visible y poco reconocido. Muchas gracias, Antonio, por haber fallado los premios y por lo menos haber comunicado que era uno de nuestros objetivos a la hora de organizar el Congreso, poder dar inicio a estos premios, y que, bueno, pues es la primera edición y esperemos que en los siguientes congresos pues haya nuevos premios, nuevos premiados, etc. No sé si quieres tú, para terminar, contar dónde va a ser el próximo congreso, y ya doy unas palabras de cierre protocolarias. El micro.
Fran, yo creo que es mejor que lo comente siempre la institución que ha cerrado el congreso anterior.
Vale, perfecto. Pues entonces paso yo a hacer la última parte, la última intervención para cerrar ya el congreso. Bueno, pues hemos llegado al final de un largo camino, 2 años, con una pandemia en medio, muchas reuniones online para ver cómo hacíamos, mucha incertidumbre, pero siempre con la idea de que se iba a hacer. Contra viento y marea, se haría en modo virtual, en modo híbrido, y en el mejor de los casos presencial, pero yo creo que eso no nos lo creímos nunca, que pudiera ser 100% presencial, ¿no? Creo que hay que agradecer a todos los que han hecho posible este congreso. Yo creo que, en primer lugar, la Red Española de Institutos de Investigación en Educación pues nos ha dado el paraguas, nos ha dado lo que se llama en los congresos internacionales el Steering Committee, ¿no? Ese comité de organización suprema que toma las decisiones y de alguna manera que fueron tan locos como para decir que Salamanca lo hiciera en esta edición, ¿no? No sé si los locos fueron ellos o aquí nuestra señora vicerrectora que dijo que sí, adelante, ¿no? Hay que agradecer, bueno, pues a los que hacen posible esto, ¿no? En un congreso, el comité científico que revisa los trabajos, pues también muchísimas gracias por esas horas muy poco reconocidas. A todos los que asisten, obviamente. Tenemos asistentes presenciales, asistentes virtuales, que se dividen entre los que han presentado las comunicaciones, profesores de la Universidad de Salamanca que están siguiéndolo como una actividad de formación del profesorado, los conferenciantes invitados y los panelistas, ¿no? Entonces, ya sí que quiero un aplauso para todos vosotros, para los que estáis aquí, para los que estáis en online, porque realmente esto solo tiene sentido con vosotros. Entonces, vamos a aplaudir. Y fundamentalmente también una mención especial para el comité de organización, ¿no? Porque organizar un congreso siempre es complicado, es duro, pero cuando el congreso es dual, híbrido como este, se complica mucho más. Es más complicado que hacer un congreso totalmente presencial o totalmente online, ¿no? Porque tiene las complejidades de las dos cosas y entonces hay que llevarlo a cabo. No voy a decir nombres porque siempre tengo la costumbre de olvidarme a alguien, pero todos sabéis que estáis ahí, que estáis en nuestra mente, que sin vosotros sí que no hubiera sido posible. Y solamente voy a decir un nombre que debería estar aquí ahora mismo, cerrando el congreso y no yo, que Susana Susana Olmos, nuestra directora del instituto, que por una larga baja médica, por un problema que se le ha ido complicando, pues no ha podido estar con nosotros, aunque ha hecho muchísimo trabajo, y entonces, bueno, pues desde aquí, Susana, seguro que nos estás escuchando, que sepas que me debes una por estar yo aquí cerrando y no tú. Pero, de verdad, ahora sí que te vamos a dar un aplauso para ti solita. Me gustaría destacar una cosa, yo creo que cerrando el ciclo que se hizo con la apertura, que es destacar una idea que tenemos en este instituto desde hace mucho tiempo, ¿no? Que es trabajar en el contexto de investigación educativa desde una perspectiva interdisciplinar, dar cabida a todas las disciplinas que realmente pueden aportar algo en un momento yo creo que muy complejo, donde la educación es muy necesaria y donde todos tenemos que apoyar un poquito desde lo que sabemos, ¿no? Para trabajar conjuntos y realmente es algo muy difícil, trabajar unos con otros, ya siendo de la misma familia, si encima somos de diferentes familias, pues se complica mucho más, ¿no? Y creo que en este instituto es lo que siempre ha sido nuestra señal de identidad y algo que también hemos encontrado en esta red, no solamente, es decir, realmente todos los institutos que forman la red tienen una filosofía similar y yo creo que esto es lo que enriquece, lo que nos permite que tengamos ilusión por seguir trabajando, por continuar y por visitar la próxima sede que yo creo que va a ser un poquito, pues no sé, un poco atractiva, nadie le va a gustar ir a Palma de Mallorca, esas cosas, ¿no? Entonces habrá que ir por lo científico. Entonces, muchas gracias al Instituto de Investigación de Islas Baleares que va a organizar en 2023 en Palma de Mallorca el congreso. Y con esto, pues ya me callo, ya dejo de hablar, me habéis escuchado mucho durante todos estos días y simplemente agradeceros a todos de nuevo vuestra presencia. Muchas gracias.